I read it, and I have some thoughts. Welcome to Jen's Book Club. Or, rather, Book Corner, because this isn't much of a club and more just the corner of my bedroom. The book for this week's book club gathering is The Lonely Ones, which is the new addition to the Little Nightmares universe written by E.C. Myers. Soon we'll be catching up to our FNAF brothers and sisters with how many books that will be added into the franchise. This book was released in early September, with good time to read it before Little Nightmares 3 was going to be released, except I speed read it in about a week, and now I have to put out a video before it comes out in a couple days from filming. But my excuse is that I started uni 4 weeks ago, so you can let me off the hook. But when I read this book, I was expecting it to answer some of the questions that I had about the Little Nightmares universe. Because the characters in the game never speak, I was so excited to actually hear the thoughts and words of some of the children in the book, and maybe understand their motives and their inner dialogue a little bit more, especially as they traverse the nowhere, because if I were stuck in such a hellish place, I would definitely have some thoughts about it too. But instead of it clearing up some things, I came away from the book with more questions than answers. So why don't we go through some of the things that I picked up from reading The Lonely Ones, and explore them together. Also, for anyone who saw my first video, don't get jump scared, but I redesigned my puppet character. She has more emotions now. The plot of The Lonely Ones follows a girl called Ruse, who wakes up drenched in water inside of a moving carousel. The entire book takes place at the carnival, first introduced in the Sounds of Nightmares podcast, and then revealed to be one of the locations in Little Nightmares 3, as Ruse teams up with two other kids, a boy called Feast and a girl called Mim. The fact that we're at the carnival again must mean something, right? It's appeared the most out of every single location in the Little Nightmares franchise, so it's either extremely integral to the plot, or Supermassive Games is just getting lazy. And for the sake of the franchise, I choose to believe it's the first. Each chapter is mostly a new challenge that the trio have to face. At first, it's getting off the moving carousel and away from the grubby-faced, doe-like giants, similar to the guests from the moor. Then it's escaping a paper maze, set on fire by a fallen tent, as a large blind centipede chases them. Then it's encountering the performer, who is the main antagonist of the whole book, as he takes control of Mim to attack the others, alongside puppet creatures reminiscent of the porcelain bullies from the second game. And then the last 3 or so chapters are the juiciest and most confusing parts of the book. But I don't want to spoil anything in the first few minutes of the video, so let's take a look at some of the points I made as I was reading. First off, the main characters. Ruse is the lead main character of the story, and I was immediately drawn to her name. As we know, most, if not all, of the children in the Nowhere go by a nickname, and quite often their nicknames represent them and their fate. Mono ends up by himself in the signal tower at the end of the second game, confirming his name. Six, I have theorized, is the 6th person to wear her infamous yellow raincoat, or even possibly the 6th person to take over the moor, with the lady before her being the 5th. We see paintings around the lady's quarters that may confirm this. And the runaway kid's name is, obviously, well, pretty self-explanatory. So with Ruse being called Ruse, what does that say about her and where she'll end up? Well, first of all, the word ruse means trick. If you uncover a ruse, it's usually exposing something deceiving. So is Ruse, the character, deceiving? Despite her reoccurring thoughts about only wanting to look out for herself, which could be interpreted as deceiving the other 2 children she's with, she does eventually end up coming around to staying with them as she grows fond of Feast and Mim. So, does she fulfill her name in the distant future then, if not in the events of the book? Possibly. But also, her name very closely fits with how she got to the Nowhere. Children travel to the Nowhere in their dreams, but travelling is just a temporary thing. Eventually children fully cross into the Nowhere, and this is based on how much they have suffered in the real world, aka the counties. This was explained to us through Noon's story in The Sound of Nightmares, where she starts by visiting the Nowhere in her dreams, and then eventually the ferryman comes to collect her, and then she finally fully crosses into this alternate realm. This is because it is revealed to us that Noon has a tumour in her brain, which has taken the peculiar shape of an eye. I have previously thought that the ferryman comes to collect the children who are suffering because they have passed away. This is due to the ferryman being a reference to Charon in Greek mythology, who was thought to take dead people to the afterlife by boat. And this connection makes sense in Noon's context, but how can it be a strong theory if there are no other connections? Well, going back to Ruse, the very start of the book opens with her sopping wet from head to toe. And not from sweat like you would imagine you would be after waking up from a nightmare. No, she's drenched in water. And as she looks around at the two other children she's with, there's a girl with a rope around her neck and a boy who looks gaunt and pale, clearly starved. Coincidentally, their names are Mim and Feast. Clearly the starved boy's name being Feast is pretty ironic, and Mim is a word used to mean shy, which Mim is during the start of the book. As Ruse studies the two children she's stuck with, she also notes that they don't look like they're from her time. I imagine Feast could be from the 80s or 90s, as he has a red bandana covering his mouth and nose, and they were popular in that time period. And Mim could be from the 15th century, as the rope around her neck implies that she was possibly hung, and this could have been during the witch trials in England and Scotland, especially since Mim is considered a Scottish word by Google. I also briefly searched up the word Mim, and the first thing to come up was Madam Mim the Witch, who was a character from a 1960s Disney movie, which does help prove my point. This leads me on to say that the children in the Nowhere don't just have to be named after the things in their future, they may also be named after the things in their past. Ruse may have drowned to death, referencing that constantly as the last thing she did, which was jumping into the pool at her nanny's house. Feast could have starved, and Mim could have been a target during the witch trials, and after their deaths, the ferryman found them and brought them to the Nowhere, this state of hellish purgatory that only children can access. And the significance of the fact that Ruse drowned doesn't just stop there, because these are the ferryman's exact words from The Sound of Nightmares. Sink, sink, into these tideless waters. Now pair that with what Ruse says about trusting others. The last time she had trusted someone completely, hardly a stranger, she had paid a terrible price. How much do you want to bet that the ferryman appeared in many of Ruse's previous ventures into the Nowhere, just like Noon, and when she finally took his words, that is how she ended up drowning, taking sink, sink, literally. Especially when she begins to sink into a ball pit in chapter 8, thinking, sinking, sinking, sinking in Nanny's pool, almost repeating the ferryman's words. And this is how she got her name, Ruse, meaning trick, because she was tricked into believing that the ferryman would save her from her life in the counties, with distant parents and a dull childhood. Alongside this too, Ruse wakes up with an old pocket watch, which has been damaged and almost waterlogged, noticing how water droplets have beaded on the inside of the glass. This pocket watch seems incredibly relevant to Ruse, as it's what helps her remember her name when she wakes up. So did this connect her to being tricked too? Possibly. The book seems to infer that the pocket watch was a gift from her parents. A piece of home, a reminder of where she came from, it quotes. But it also reminds her of the fact that her parents weren't particularly loving. I quote, "She remembers how she had often felt, the intensity of wanting. Parents who didn't think caring meant buying her more things. And because of the neglect from her parents, she begins to feel attached to who she calls Nanny. The gentle old woman had loved every child in their neighborhood. Maybe too much. Too much. What does that mean?" Well, looking at what Ruse thinks about the kids from her neighborhood in the counties, there's a little hint in the quote. While those kids back home might not have known what they were doing, Ruse certainly had. Or thought she had. And what does that say about her? Ruse thought she had sense to her, or at least more than the other kids back home. At first I connected this also to the ferryman, then I realised this is about the Nanny character. And this could go two ways. This Nanny may still be the ferryman. We know from the 2017 Little Nightmares comics that the ferryman has the ability to shapeshift, especially into figures from a child's past. Or, this is a character akin to the Granny from the Depths DLC. And let me explain why. In one of the last chapters, chapter 8, Ruse jumps into a cavernous ball pit to save Feast. As she's swimming about trying to find his body, she begins to feel an entity moving towards her through the balls. I quote, "Balls in the pit rattle and clack against one another. Ruse follows the sound with her eyes to the other end of the pool, where the wooden balls are rippling. Something very big is just beneath the surface." And this reminds her of when she jumped into the pool at Nanny's house. Quote, "No matter how much she kicks and moves her arms, something holds her back, pushes her down. Something dark in the pool with her that won't let go. Will never let go." And so, if we go back to what Ruse says about Nanny, how she liked every child in their neighborhood, maybe too much, then the pieces start to connect. The Granny in the Depths DLC from the first game not only inhabits the water that sits in the bottom of the moor, like the pool that Ruse was in, but she also has a tendency to drag children down to the bottom. I don't think this was ever for Milish's intent though. It just might get lonely down in the depths, and she needed a friend. Hence why when a small child comes along, like the runaway kid in the DLC, she takes any opportunity to play with them, like dolls, because apart from accidentally drowning the children, she doesn't actually do any harm to them. She doesn't try to eat them like the guests, since she primarily eats fish. She doesn't try to stuff them into pots or the oven like the chefs. She doesn't wrap them up to send away like the janitor. And she doesn't have the same powers as the lady. She's just a lonely old woman, like Ruse's nanny. And now we branch off again. If the thing in Nanny's pool is so similar to the granny, what does that mean for the crossover between the counties and the Nowhere? Because allegedly, this event happened while Ruse was still in the counties, and being dragged into the pool was what brought her into the Nowhere. But the granny is already from the Nowhere. Was Ruse really in the counties like she thought? Was she already in the Nowhere? Or did Nanny just creepily sit at the bottom of her pool waiting to capture kids? None of those questions are very easy to answer, so you guys might have to help me out in the comments. What do you think about this storyline in the book? Do you have your own theories or explanations, or are you just as bewildered as me? Because not only did this whole plotline raise questions for me, but so did many other aspects of this book. So why don't we look at some of them? In chronological order throughout the book, as soon as Ruse gets out of the center of the carousel, she starts to take note of the seats on the ride. They are shaped and modeled like big insects, with a particular dun-colored moth being referenced more than once. This immediately reminded me of the oversized moth from Little Nightmares 2, and the possible lean that Tarsier Studios wanted to take with Little Nightmares that they are now exploring in their upcoming project Reanimal. This lean was also to do with oversized animals in general. Little Nightmares 2 concept art references this, particularly following the concept of reanimation and puppetry, which is very common in this book, especially as the next chapter involves a chase with a giant blind centipede, which when cut in half is still able to run away, back end first. Ruse even specifically points out that the centipede looks like it came off of the carousel ride, and I wouldn't be surprised if it actually did. The rides and attractions in this book are also littered with the eye motif. There's a carving of an eye above the organ in the carousel. The paper hedge maze that burns down leaves a scorch mark in the shape of an eye, and when exploring the performer's tent, Ruse even spots an eye staring at her. I'm already working on a theory to do with the representation of the eye in Little Nightmares, but the more I learn about it, the more I begin to realise the extent of its all-seeingness. I don't want to spoil much, but I think the eye might be the deity of the Little Nightmares universe. Speaking of which, the fact that the book takes place at the carnival as the third instance of this location popping up in the Little Nightmares franchise is quite interesting to me, because one of my favourite movies is Wendell and Wild, which is a Henry Selick and Jordan Peele animated movie, and the plot revolves around two demon brothers trying to build a better amusement park to outperform their father, who is the devil. But then if this amusement park is supposed to represent hell in this universe, what does that make the rest of the Nowhere? And what does that make the all-seeing eye? That's something to think about. Going back to Ruse's pocket watch, I also have some thoughts about it. The significance of the watch isn't really stated clearly, apart from it most likely being a gift from her parents, but theme-wise, what could it mean? I was immediately thinking about time loops, like Mono being trapped as the Thin Man for all of eternity, but it could also very well be taken literally, taking the word watch out of pocket watch, and linking it back to the all-seeing eye motif throughout the franchise. But because it isn't really talked about much in the book, apart from the lines I already stated, this is also something to come back to another day. When in the performer's room, Ruse takes a look around and notices masks hanging on the wall. I immediately thought back to the wall of masks in the doctor's room in Little Nightmares 2, but Ruse is able to try on a mask and it fits her perfectly. These specific masks are made for the children, which is rather interesting to me as one of the biggest thoughts I've had regarding the world of Little Nightmares is that children are entertainment. It's like it's flipped. Instead of adults entertaining kids, it's kids entertaining adults. And this is why the adults in the carnival are so eager to reach out and grab Ruse, Feast, and Mim as they run past. I think they just see it as part of the show. And this could apply to much more than just the carnival. In the Nowhere, children are seen more as tools or a means to move forward. In the Moor, they are turned into gnomes and used to run the ship, or are seen as food. In the Pale City, they are possibly used for entertainment purposes too. In concept art for the game, we see children connected to the TV through their heads, perhaps to extract their childlike thoughts and wonder for fun TV shows. And even in the Sounds of Nightmares, particularly in the bathhouse, children are used to scrub the bathers. But one of the main reasons I think the children are being used as entertainment is, once again, the eye. The all-seeing eye is watching these children traverse the Nowhere, and even if the children aren't entertaining to the residents, they're entertaining to this ever-watching entity who tortures them, essentially, for its own pleasure. But like I said, more on that in the future. One particular part of this book that left my mouth hanging open in shock was also when the trio were exploring the performer's tent. Feast climbs up onto a shelf while they're hiding from the performer, and knocks over a statue. Ruse gets worried, expecting the crash to make noise, but it doesn't, and instead a black smoke rises from the shards. As soon as I read this part, I had to take a step back for a while. I was so bewildered. This isn't the first time for this to happen, because this is literally an exact description of the lady statues in the first Little Nightmares game. And while this may just be a fun Easter egg, I want to believe that this is more serious, because this would imply that the lady has far more reach than not just the Moor, and not just the Pale City, where we can find a shrine to her in a secret apartment in the second game, but all across the Nowhere. This makes me want to discuss how influential the lady is in the Nowhere, and why, because these are not coincidences. Okay, this is the last thing I wanted to talk about from The Lonely Ones, and this thing also left my mouth agape in disbelief. In one of the last few chapters, Ruse spots a hot air balloon. It's when they're at the top of the roller coaster ride, and they realise that not only is the carnival on a flying ship, but it also has a hot air balloon that transports patrons to and from the venue, and Ruse's immediate thought is, that is how we leave. Now I couldn't believe this when I read it, because this was a theory that I had watched ages ago when The Sounds of Nightmares came out. One of the best Little Nightmares theorists, Gemini, made a really great theory proposing that the way out of the Nowhere was up. This mostly came from Rusty in the podcast, from the episode of the carnival, trying to get to the top of the circus tent as a way to escape, and the book now basically confirms that this idea was right, at least in terms of the carnival. But then, here comes me, thinking once again in afterlife terms. If up is good, does that make it heaven? And does that confirm that the Nowhere is hell? I guess we'll just have to wait and find out. So what can we predict about Little Nightmares 3 from this book? Obviously, the book taking place at the carnival must be significant, especially after the reveal of the hot air balloon being a way out. So if we take the names of the characters from the new game and analyse them just like I did with Ruse, Feast and Mim, what does that give us? Well, Lo is quite an interesting name. To me it feels like it's predicting the future rather than following the past like Ruse, and this is the same with Alone. The locations from the third game that we know of so far are the Necropolis, the Candy Factory and the Carnival, and so my prediction is that the Carnival is the last location we'll visit. Just like Ruse and the other kids, Lo and Alone will spot the hot air balloon as a way out and try to get to it as their mission, but almost like Mono from Little Nightmares 2, Alone will manage to escape, and Lo will fall, sinking deeper and deeper into the Nowhere, further and further away from heaven. So what do we think? Do you guys think this could be a plausible end to the game, or are you hoping for a happier ending in this franchise for once? Do you have any predictions of your own? Like Six coming back, or maybe we'll get a cameo from the lady again? Let me know down in the comments, and I'll respond to as many as I can as we all get excited for the game to come out. But aside from that, that'll be it for this video. Thanks so much for watching. I have been Jen, and hopefully you have been horrified.